Now that you have a list of use cases of what people will be coming to your system to do, you can think about how all of that fits together in a flow. How will users flow from one screen to another to accomplish the use cases that they need to do in your application? There are several ways to think about this. One of the documents we can create is an information architecture. We can think about all of the information that the system has to capture and how it's all related to each other. You might have contacts, and for each one of those contacts, you might have contact information. You might have media that goes with those contacts. You might have contextual information that goes with those contacts, maybe the weather where they are, the location where they are. You can have all of this really, really rich information about each of the contacts. You might have settings, you might have subsettings in those settings. So creating an information architecture that just shows all of the information your system has to manage is often a first step, both towards creating data models for ultimately coding your system, but as well as thinking about the design of your system and how you might want to present that. You can see where natural hierarchies emerge, where you might have a group of contacts, an individual contact, and then sets of content for that particular contact. So an information architecture just really helps you take stock of all the information you'll be gathering in your system. Another model you can create, and what you'll probably want to do next, is create an interaction model. So at a very high level, without showing any of the detail of individual screens, think about how different screens fit together. This is an example from our contact list, and you can see that users were able to go back and forth and swipe between different views of a contact, both at a group level and at a detail level. So when looking at their whole contact list, they could see the traditional A to Z list of all of their contacts, but then they could swipe over and see their favorites. They could see contacts that had recent social updates. They could see contacts that they were about to have meetings with in the near future. And they could swipe back and forth between all these different views of their contacts. If they went into a particular contact, then they could swipe back and forth between different aspects of that contact. They could see the contact info, the email address, the phone number, the physical address, and they could swipe over and see their communication history with them. What had they talked about? What text messages or Facebook messages or tweets had they exchanged with that contact over time? They could swipe again and they could see the social updates from that friend, the photos that they had posted online, the status updates that they had posted online. They could swipe over again and see things like the location and weather where that person was. And they could just swipe back and forth between all of those different facets of someone's identity. And so this was our overall interaction model for the system, thinking about at a group level and an individual level, how could people swipe back and forth between all of these different ways of arranging the contacts, as well as arranging all of the rich context about those contacts, and then showing that they could get back and forth between the group view and the individual view by clicking on any contact. So think about your system, think about the different types of interaction, the way the information could be shown, and the way that people could go back and forth between different views of that information when you're creating your interaction model. And then you can also start to think about affordances and interface design, thinking about what some of those sketches of those screens can look like. And here's where it's a very iterative process, right? In your interaction model, you might think that you could have a screen that shows 7 or 8 different things. And when it comes down to actually sketching out what that screen might look like, you see that it becomes too crowded or too confusing. And then you might split it out into 2 different screens. So generally, I work back and forth between these two, drawing an interaction model, drawing out some sketches of some of the screens, working back and forth and editing, and getting to something that really works, that isn't trying to be too complex on any given screen, and where the flows work really naturally for someone to complete the use cases. So when you're looking at your interaction model, when you're looking at the screens, go through each of those use cases that you enumerated previously and see what set of screens users would have to go through to accomplish each of those use cases. And then you can see what might be too hard for people, what might be really easy to do, and make sure that those frequent use cases are really, really easy. They make sense. They don't involve going through too many screens. Here's an example of what a flow looked like for a system I created back in 2006, the zone tag system. This was a project we did with Motorola and Yahoo Research. And you can see that the flow doesn't need to be precisely produced. This doesn't need to be a pretty document or a pretty artifact. You can just rapidly sketch what each of your screens look like. You can draw arrows between each of the screens to show how someone could navigate. And then you can see here I arranged it based on different use cases. There's the kind of first-time flow of someone coming into the app and signing up. There's the flow of taking a new photo. There's the flow of uploading an existing photo that they have stored on their phone. And so you can easily see how each of those flows progresses, what screens users need to interact with for each of those flows, what prompts and labels are there to make sure that users can figure out what next step they need to go to. So now we'd like you to think about your project, to think about the overall interaction design of that from an information architecture point of view, from a flow point of view between screens, and draw out some of those models. Draw out an interaction model, draw out an information diagram, draw out what some of the screens look like as you're going along and what the flow looks like between those screens. And then go over it for each of your use cases and see that everything's flowing well. This will be a really iterative process, so try it 5 or 6 times or even more until you get to something that you feel will work really well for your users.